Hello again, everyone, and welcome to the Front Line with Joe and Joe. Joe Pasillo is always joined by Joe Resinello. And once more, dear friends, we are going into the breach. And so for those of you who follow Joe and I, you know we do a number of interviews, and we pretty much, we talk about a lot of different things. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about church history. And we're pleased to be joined by Mike Aquilina. And I just want to give Mike a brief introduction. Mike Aquilina is a popular author working in the area of church history, especially patristics. And he's the executive vice president and trustee of the St. Paul Center for Biblical Theology, a Roman Catholic research center that's based in Steubenville, Ohio. He's a contributing editor of Angelus Magazine and the general editor of the Reclaiming Catholic History series from Ave Maria Press. He hosts The Way of the Fathers, a podcast produced by CatholicCulture.org. He's the author and editor of over 50 books, including The Fathers of the Church, The Mass of the Early Christians, and Angels of God. Mike has also collaborated closely with the St. Paul Center for Biblical Theology, which he has served as an executive and trustee and a contributing editor to Angelus News. Mike's a Phi Beta Kappa graduate from Penn State University, where he received the university's Oswald Award for Achievement in Journalism and Mass Media. He and his wife, Terry, have been married since 1985. They're the parents of 6 children and numerous grandchildren. Mike Aquilina, welcome to the Front Line with Joe and Joe, my friend.
Hey, thanks for having me, Joe.
Awesome. So
3 Italians, love it.
3 pies. That's what makes it even better. 3 paisans in the same place talking about church history.
Love it.
You can't make this stuff up. Joe Resinello, I'm going to kick it over to you, and we have a set of questions where we want to talk to Mike. We're going to stick this conversation is going to stick basically to the first questions that Joe and I have had, either in questions that have come up from other people or questions we had in the past within the first 500 years of church history. So basically the last 500 years of the Roman Empire. So, and they're good questions. They're questions that we think you audience members would probably be interested in. Joe Resinello, I'm going to kick it over to you.
Well, as our custom, we always begin with a prayer because all good things start with a prayer. And as we all know, this is a good thing. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. Remember, O most gracious Virgin Mary, that never was it known that anyone who sought your help or sought your intercession was left unaided. Inspired by this confidence, we find to you a virgin's our mother. To you we come, before you we stand, sinful and sorrowful. O Mother of the Word incarnate, despise not our petitions, but in your clemency hear and answer us. Amen. Our Lady of Victory, pray for us. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. Well, Mike, Joe gave you a great introduction. I think a good place to start is, the current state of Christianity, how, I guess, Americans look at it through the sola scriptura view. Most, as I just was saying, like most Americans look at the Bible alone. That's what sola scriptura is for our viewers who may not know. So why do we study the patristic fathers? Who are they, and why is it important to read their documents? If all Americans do is read the Bible, why is that important, and why should we differentiate ourselves from just the Bible alone?
Well, the fathers of the church are the great teachers from the first few centuries of Christian history. And we study them because they're witnesses to the faith as it was lived in those centuries. We've got to keep in mind that the first century church essentially had no Bible, all right? We think of the world as we know it today and as we've known it for the last few centuries since the advent of the printing press. And we think of Christians who can walk around carrying a New Testament in their shirt pocket, and they could even carry the entire Bible in their jacket pocket if their eyes are good enough to read the small print. That was not always the case. People did not always have access to the scriptures. Most people couldn't read if they had access to the scriptures. To own one book of the Bible would have been prohibitively expensive for an average Christian in the first century, second century, third century, fourth century. And even churches would have had access to a limited number of the books of the Bible. So what did the churches have? Well, they had whatever they could cobble together from the scriptures, and they lived on those. They had the liturgy of the church, the ritual public worship that was established by Jesus. They had the tradition that was passed down from the apostles through the fathers of the church. We know a good number of the earliest fathers who were converted by the apostles themselves, who learned the faith from the apostles themselves. So the fathers are important witnesses. You know, even if you want to go by sola scriptura, if you want to go by scripture alone, you have to face the question of the canon. You have to face the question of which books are the legitimate books in the Christian Bible. And if we study the early history of the church, we can see that that was something that was hotly contested in different centuries, with differing churches holding slightly different canons. There was a consensus early on, but it wasn't an exact matchup. It wasn't a universal canon until the late 4th century, the early 5th century, where a couple councils and a pope kind of gave the stamp of approval to the canon as we know it today. But all that aside, we're patristic in our orientation as Christians, because that's what biblical faith teaches us to be. If we read the Old Testament, if we read the New Testament, we find that biblical religion has always been about the faith of our fathers, right? If you see the way the apostles first took the gospel out to the world, you know, you read about it in the Acts of the Apostles, you find that they went out and they talked about God. Who is God? You know, what is this God they're talking about? Well, he's the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, the God of our fathers. And you see that even in the Old Testament, that's the way Israel talked about the God who had revealed himself to them. So I would say that biblical religion is, by its nature, patristic. It's always looking to the fathers. One of the commandments is honor your father and your mother. And it's not talking there just about biological or adoptive parents. It's talking about your ancestors. When the word fathers is used in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, it means our ancestors. So we look back to our forebears in the faith, and we look at the faith that they passed on, and we want to be faithful to it. You know, we want to match it. So I think there are lots of good reasons to study the fathers, and even people who want to live in a sola scriptura way are increasingly calling upon the witness of those early fathers, because they need it when they're challenged by atheists or agnostics or others to defend their particular canon of the Holy Scriptures.
You know, Mike, it's funny because I'm a big fan of Marcus Grodi on EWTN, and it never fails when he's brought on many guests coming from many different Christian traditions, and it never fails when people dive into the church fathers deeply, they always point to the Catholic Church. It's inevitable.
Yeah.
Like I've heard Mormons, I've heard atheists, I've heard so many different people on that show coming from no religion to the various other Christian religions. And whenever they read the church fathers, it always points to the one church that Jesus Christ founded, which is the Catholic Church.
It's impressive. You know, an important milestone for Marcus at the Coming Home Network was when he welcomed his 1,000th Protestant minister into the fullness of the Catholic faith, right? And I interviewed him at that time, and I asked him, Marcus, out of those 1,000 people you've welcomed into the Catholic Church, how many were led to the church by the fathers? And he went like this. And he said, out of 1,000, I'd have to say 1,000.
I believe it.
So, I mean, this is the role that the fathers can play in evangelization, in our Catholic witness. It's a compelling witness, and it kind of makes sense if you think about it, because so many people go to these genealogy websites, right? They want to know, who am I? What made me, and who made me the person that I am? So they dig deep into their genealogy, into their background. You know, they do all this research. A lot of people spend their retirement years trying to find out who they are based on who their forebears are. Well, it's no different in the Christian faith. We want to know where we came from. You know, what what is it that the ancient history of our faith tells us about what we're living today, how we should be living today? Consider the Dead Sea Scrolls. They were discovered in the late 1940s in Israel. And since then, that's what, 70 some years ago. Since then, they've been a constant industry, really, all their own, because people are insatiably curious about that transitional period of the Old Testament to the New Testament. And they know that the answers to some of these enigmatic statements of the New Testament of the early church fathers can be illuminated by what's in those scrolls. So I think that the commercial success of the Dead Sea Scrolls witnesses to the power of antiquity, even for believers today.
Mike, along those same lines, there's so much. Joe and I talk about it all the time. That we were born Catholic doesn't mean we were always practicing.
Right.
But so much that we both learned. Joe earlier than myself, coming back to the church, the patristic fathers and the like. One thing that I found interesting that I've always found interesting since I've discovered it, or since I heard about it and then I read it, was the Didache. And a lot of people don't know what that is. And I've read it a few times, the way of life, the way of death, and it's pretty detailed. Tell our audience, what is the Didache? When was it discovered? What does it mean? And how does it fit into what you're talking about as far as digging in to early church history to try to understand, let's say, these New Testament writings?
Well, the Didache may be the oldest Christian document that we possess. At least parts of it are that old. Right now, most recent scholarship, Clayton Jefford, Enrico Mazza, say that the liturgical portions of the Didache, the ritual portions of the Didache, were probably set down no later than 48 AD. So that makes it older than most of the documents, if not all of them, in the New Testament. That's pretty impressive, and it's a great kind of window into the life of the early church. And it contains a lot of quotations from the Gospels, especially the Gospel of St. Matthew. But it also witnesses to what the church did, how they lived, what were their moral concerns, how did they pray. We see from the Didache that it was typical for a Christian to pray the Our Father 3 times a day, for example. It was typical of a Christian to fast twice a week. The Didache tells us how the early Christians baptized, and it tells us certain ways that you shouldn't baptize. What were the preferred ways? What were acceptable ways? They considered all of these questions even in the early generation. And the Didache also includes Eucharistic prayers that are clearly about the Holy Eucharist, prayers of offering, and prayers of communion, prayers to pray after receiving Holy Communion. The Didache speaks of the Mass as a sacrifice, as the sacrifice of the church, and the Didache encourages confession of sins before reception of Holy Communion. So it's a remarkable document. It's this, as I said, a window into the life of the early church. It was revered by the fathers, and in some places it was considered almost to be like the witness of Scripture, because it's the teaching that's kind of gathered up from the apostles. It's the teaching that the apostles left behind in the churches. What's interesting is that it was kind of built upon in later centuries. There are documents of the 3rd century and 4th century that were built upon the foundation of the Didache, but the Didache itself went missing for many centuries, and it was only discovered by an Orthodox patriarch at the end of the 19th century, and it was published to great sensation immediately in many languages, and it's still a subject of fascination today because of what it tells us about the early church. When we see the Didache, when we see some of the earliest writings of the fathers, what's heartening for Catholics is that you look into it and it looks like your parish. the Christians in that first generation are doing what we're doing at our parishes today. In another writer from the early church who has this effect on many readers is Ignatius of Antioch, because he's practically obsessed with the Holy Eucharist. He talks about it all the time. He witnesses to the three-level hierarchy of the church. He witnesses to so many of the practices that we're familiar with from ordinary parish life today. So it can be very encouraging for Catholics to get into these earliest documents of the church. I'm not even talking about, the 100s, the 200s, the 300s. I'm not talking about those later centuries. I'm talking about the very first century and those earliest teachers we call the Apostolic Fathers.
Mike, we all know, I mean, through the movies and, through just basically like basic knowledge of Christianity, that the early Christians suffered. I mean, that suffering went on from the first century, from Nero, to the third century, through Diocletian. I'd like to talk about the significance of that suffering and that martyrdom. As we all know, that the church was founded on the blood of martyrs. I'd like to focus on how they suffered and the witness of them bearing their cross. And please, I mean, because you're the historian, from what I have been told, I think the first almost like 300 years of Christianity, every single pope was martyred. I could be wrong in that, but that's what I was told. And yet it persevered. And not only did it persevere, it spread. Mm-hmm. I'd like to focus in on that, because today people are too quick to throw off their cross. These are people that endured a very, very, very heavy cross. And Christianity, as a result of it, spread throughout the known world.
Yeah. Martyrdom, the fact of martyrdom, the historical fact of martyrdom, witnesses to Christianity's status as a square peg. It doesn't fit. The historian Larry Hurtado, who just died recently, text critic, said, in his book, which I think was his last book, he made the case that Christianity invented religion as we know it. Okay, well, what was religion in those years? In those early years? Well, religion was what was ever observed in your locale. So you had certain local gods you worshipped. If you lived in Egypt, if you lived in Greece, and if you lived in Rome, you had your local pantheon. Other gods, foreign gods, could be kind of adopted into it, and they would find their place in the pantheon. They could be worshipped as one of many of those gods. And usually, these accumulations of gods in different places had a chief god, but they were in no sense monotheistic. They were kind of a riot of gods that had been assembled willy-nilly over the centuries. In the world of early Christianity, the emperor decided matters of religion. Religion was a state affair. It was a public service, really, and the Roman gods were imposed, and other gods could be admitted by way of concession. Okay, if the emperor felt particularly generous, he would allow the worship of Egyptian gods in Rome, but it was always by way of concession. And we know that sometimes that right to worship those Egyptian gods was revoked. It was taken away by the emperors. Christianity never enjoyed that kind of concession. And why is that? Because some of the emperors, for example, had a liking for Jesus Christ, and they would include him in their altars in their homes. Okay, Christ among the many gods. And he could tolerate that as a typical Roman. But no Christian could tolerate that. Okay, no Christian could say, okay, yeah, I'll accept all your local gods as long as you're accepting Jesus Christ. It's not going to happen. Our God is a jealous God. The God of Jews and Christians is a jealous God. He revealed himself as such in the book of Genesis. And he's not going to share space, that ultimate space in our lives. So Christians could never fit. They could never be made to fit into into the Roman idea of religion, the Greek idea of religion, the Egyptian idea of religion. It just wasn't going to happen, and it didn't happen. And it caused these terrible situations where Christians were persecuted. The other thing that happened was that Christians were calling for a revolution in personal morals, a new idea of the family, a new idea of family life. And they're saying that things like "thou shalt not commit adultery." Well, man, Roman life in the first century, second century, marriage was important as a social contract, but it was not important in the way it was to Christians. There was nothing sacramental about it, really, and cheating happened like crazy. It was expected, because usually what happened with marriage, it was an arranged union, often between a man who was about 30 years old and a girl who was about 11 or 12. They didn't have a lot in common, all right? And they weren't expected to have a deep friendship. And here comes St. Paul saying, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and, laid his life down for it. That's a radical change in family life. And so it's a radical change in social life. And it started to really upset the Roman apple cart. So many of the early martyrs that we know about were women denounced by their husbands because they had adopted Christianity and given up their former ways. They would no longer live within their marriage the way they had been living before. They would live in marriage, but not the way they were living before. So their husbands denounced them. This is the story of so many of the martyrs. We don't appreciate how revolutionary Christianity was in those early years, and just how much it was a threat to the social order. There's a great book about it, The Christians as the Romans Saw Them, by Robert Louis Wilkin. It's a brilliant book because it gives us a sympathetic view of how the pagans were threatened. They saw Christianity as undermining their entire achievement. Everything that we have always believed, the worship of the household gods and the national gods, the imperial gods, and they saw Christianity as a threat to the social order. It was
Mike, you mentioned a word that's so important, revolutionary.
Yes.
I always say that to people. Christ was the greatest revolutionary that ever walked the face of the earth. Too many people don't view him in that way. Yeah. He was a revolutionary. I mean, I look at it like from my perspective, there was a time I ran in one direction, I stopped short, and now I run in the other. We must embrace a radical Christianity.
Yeah.
Christ was a radical man. And as a result, those who live radically change the world. And Christ clearly did. And these martyrs who went against the grain that you're talking about did just that. And they made a serious impression on the Western world as we know it.
Yeah. It's funny that when you think about it, like modern Americans, they talk about like, we're progressive. Progressing towards what? It seems like they're progressing towards pre-Christian paganism.
Yes.
It's like everything that's embraced now, it's nothing new. As Ecclesiastes says, there's nothing new under the sun. Okay. It's all the same, maybe just in sometimes in different forms, but everything that progressives currently, many things, let me say, currently embrace. This is what Christianity undid. Mm-hmm. Yes, even today, I think the parallel is clear. It makes people uncomfortable when you talk about what you're talking about, Mike. Let's say solid families, lots of kids, pro-life, pro-family, all these things. It makes people very uncomfortable.
Yeah. Well, change always appears to be a threat. It is a threat to something, especially this kind of revolutionary change. What we no longer appreciate, I think, is that the ideas that we take for granted, the defining civilizational ideas that we love the most, universal human dignity, human equality, women's rights, children's rights, the institution of the hospital, the institution of the university, the idea of universal education, public schooling, all of these things were Christian innovations, that they arrived in those early centuries as Christian things. And we have them today because Christians introduced them in the 1st century, 2nd century, 3rd century, 4th century. And if we see these things eroding today, if we see them falling apart, well, maybe it's because we have no foundations to build them on. They were built upon certain biblical ideas. The idea of human dignity, the idea of human dignity comes from the book of Genesis, that all men and women are created in the image and likeness of God. That's huge. That's huge. It's transforming. And that was not something that's universal. It's not something that's apparent. Human equality is not apparent to anyone. It seems that we're very much unequal. We have different gifts. We have different talents. Some of us have more money than others. What happens apart from a revelation like that is that we always come to favor power and strength and money, the stuff that talks in worldly terms. There's a great book that came out last year called Dominion. It's by a historian who's not a believer, but he is sincerely worried about what's happening with the erosion of Christianity, because he does not think that the ideals that we hold most dear are sustainable apart from Christian foundations. Now, he's not saying let's all become Christian. He's just raising the question of what do we do now? This is a real problem. And he's saying that the only people who face this problem squarely are Nietzsche and de Sade, who were both nihilists. So is that where we're heading? Is that where we want to go? The agnostic Rodney Stark, when he wrote his book, The Rise of Christianity, tracking church growth in the first few centuries, he raised the same questions. He showed us very starkly the world that we came out of, the world we were saved from. And he's saying, we seem to be going back to that now. Is that something that we really want? And if it's not, how do we stop it? And again, these men are not believers. They're just witnessing to the evidence that they find in human history.
Mike, let's expand on that idea, because in Rome, basically, if you were male, if you were rich, if you were educated, clearly you were not, you were clearly above everybody. Yeah. I mean, there are societies today, sadly, particularly in India. I'm pretty versed in that culture. I've been there a number of times, and I've seen that firsthand, the caste system. And India there's a very small percentage of Christians in India. It's dominated by the Hindu belief system, and there's probably about 17% Muslim population, maybe 2%. So that is a real deal. That was Rome. Christianity brought that idea in, which you just talked about, that we are made in the image and likeness of God, slave, free. Paul says this. He addresses this. That is a revolutionary idea. That brings freedom to people. That is attractive, and it should be attractive, especially to people. All of us are sons of Italy. We came here to this country. My grandfather came at 16, didn't speak the language. He worked in a factory. He raised his family, practiced his faith, and then 2 generations later, I have a postgraduate degree. I'm educated. That happens nowhere else, and that happens under no other religion.
Yeah.
And that is the gift of Christianity to the world. Could we talk a little bit about that, how that related to Rome itself?
Well, it is attractive. If we look at the first critics of Christianity, one of the great critics of early Christianity was a man named Celsus, or Celsus, depending on how you were trained to pronounce Latin. But he wrote a book on the true doctrine, okay, to counteract the doctrine of the Christians, which was enjoying explosive appeal in his world. Now, he was a very well-educated man, and he wrote all the standard textbooks of his time. He wrote a textbook on medicine. He wrote textbooks on geography, on all kinds of things. He wanted to create a mass of human knowledge. He was the Wikipedia of the 2nd century, all right? He wanted to get all this stuff together in one place. And he considered Christianity important enough to go after with a book that would be devastating to the efforts at evangelization. Uh, and Christians were still engaging that book 100 years later. What did he find repugnant about Christianity? Well, it was offensive to the values of the Greco-Roman culture. All right, and he mocked Christianity because it gave such importance to a low-class man. He was just a laborer. He worked with his hands, whereas the ideal in his world, in Celsus's world, was that you didn't work at all. You were a member of the leisured class, and you had other people do the hard work for you. Well, here Christianity was exalting a carpenter, and its big apostle was a tent maker, for heaven's sake. These were ordinary day laborers. This was a crazy idea, and women were playing an important role in the spread of Christianity. Women had critical roles to play within the church. They were teachers. They were exalted. They were the heroes in the epic literature of Christianity. Look at the Virgin Mary. He used her as an example. Here was this woman who spun and wove and worked with her hands. She was poor. What did she know? So it was this witness. He provides this witness to the exaltation of the poor. Jesus spoke of that in the Sermon on the Mount, and the apostles witnessed to it as they brought the gospel out to the world. Well, Celsus, as this pagan, shows us that it's true, and it came to life in the early church. It's something that was real, and it was seen as revolutionary. It was seen as a threat.
So, Mike, just to pick up from there, I want to just talk a little bit about one thing that Joe and I hear a lot in conversations is, and it's all over social media, constant refrain. Constantine founded the Catholic Church. Okay, there was no Catholic Church before Constantine. Okay, which if you know anything about it, obviously you kind of chuckle at that. Please dispel that notion. Tell us who was Constantine. Obviously, Joe spoke about. And you spoke about the persecution that led, let's say, up to Diocletian. So Constantine was, I believe, the next emperor after Diocletian, if I got my Roman history correct. Why was he important? And please dispel the notion that he founded the Catholic Church.
Well, Constantine is an important figure. He is not the figure, however, that you find in the books of in the pages of potboilers like the Da Vinci Code, where he's made this mad scientist who invented Christianity. That didn't happen at all. What you'll sometimes find is in Protestant histories, they'll identify Constantine as the pivotal figure. That was the point where everything went wrong, where everything went liturgical, where everything went sacramental, where the church in its meetings took on the pomp of the imperial rituals. Well, that's just not true. We possess liturgies from the 1st century, 2nd century, 3rd century, before Constantine was even in diapers, okay? Before he was a twinkle in his daddy's eye. And all of those things show that there was no real change between the church as we find it in 290 AD, before Constantine came to power, and the church as we experience it in 330, near the end of Constantine's life. It was the same church, with the same ritual, with the same values, with the same teachings. There is continuity in the doctrine. The doctrine becomes a little more explicit, into the 4th century, because by then the church was above ground. It was legal. And that's about all you can say for the difference. The high view of the sacraments was there in the earliest church. Ignatius of Antioch witnessed to it in 100. So who was Constantine, and what difference did he make? Well, he was very important in Christian history because, for 300 years at that point, a little bit less than 300 years, but for almost 3 centuries, the church had been praying for peace. They wanted an end to persecution. and this is something they prayed ardently for. Well, as the 3rd century turned to the 4th, the church underwent the most fierce, systematic, extensive persecution in all of its history up to that point, under the Emperor Diocletian. Okay, and this hit the Christian church hard. A lot of influential people were executed. They were killed as martyrs. It was devastating. Historians call it a Holocaust. Constantine took the throne in Rome, and he changed that. Constantine's mother was a Christian. Constantine himself may already have been a crypto-Christian at that time, but for whatever reason, he said he had a vision of the cross in the clouds the night before he took Rome, and he heard a voice from heaven saying, "By this sign you shall conquer." And he did conquer, and so he owed his allegiance to the cross of Christ. People will sometimes say that he imposed Christianity on a reluctant pagan world, but that's just not true. It doesn't jibe with the history of the centuries before that, or his own. It doesn't jibe with the record we have of his own actions. What was the history up to that point? Well, Rodney Stark demonstrates conclusively in his book, The Rise of Christianity, and in its sequel, Cities of God, he demonstrates conclusively that the church, through its first 3 centuries, when it was illegal, when the practice of Christianity was a capital crime, when it was punishable by death, the church grew at a steady rate of 40% per decade. I want to say that again, 40% per decade. Now, you don't look surprised because your parish has been growing at a rate of 40% per decade. My parish hasn't, okay? Although my parish has been growing, but not at 40% per decade. And that's a shocking thing when you see it. So Constantine did not so much effect the Christian revolution as acknowledge the revolution and acknowledge that the war was over. Constantine was more a surrender, in my opinion. He was surrendering to the inevitable movement of history. In his acts, in what we call the Edict of Milan, but also then the later edicts of Palestine and some of the others that were promulgated in the East, he did not impose Christianity as a state religion. In other actions, he did favor Christianity, but not in a domineering way, as other emperors had persecuted Christianity in a domineering way. What Constantine did was say, look, this is a matter of conscience, and we're going to leave this up to individual conscience. This in itself was a Christian idea, first proposed by Tertullian back in the 100s in order to overcome this wave of persecution that was happening. It was later developed by another Christian, Lactantius, and Constantine just accepted it. Now, today we take it for granted. Freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, religious liberty. We take these things for granted. But these were Christian ideas that were introduced into the civilizational bloodstream by Constantine. He did not impose Christianity. He favored it, but he did not impose it, and he certainly did not suppress paganism.
And just as a quick follow-up, Mike, when was Christianity declared the official religion of the Roman Empire, and under whom?
Well, under the official religion of the Roman Empire. Well, that came much later, actually, in the late 4th century, under Theodosius in 380 AD. And to give you an idea of why that happened, there was actually a moment where a pagan emperor took the throne, and he was a former Christian. We call him Julian the Apostate. And he took the throne in the 360s, and he ruled for less than 3 years, but he really did try to roll everything back to the old-time religion, at least as he conceived it. He failed. He was killed in battle, and the empire at that time was so Christian that there was really no chance of having another pagan emperor. They weren't going to allow that, the Christian population. So ever after that, we find Christians trying to secure the position. trying to make sure that never happens again. And so you have Theodosius, who's a somewhat devout man and an orthodox man, trying to impose orthodoxy with a heavy hand on the entire empire, really the bulk of the known world at that time.
Did Julian try to, at one point, didn't he try to rebuild the temple to disprove Christianity? I think we call that a failed project. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, Julian wanted to. He saw his big project as the undermining of Christianity, and let's give him a little bit of credit here. Julian was the nephew of the Emperor Constantine, and he grew up in that crazy atmosphere of the imperial family. When Constantine died, his sons wanted to eliminate all rivals to the throne. Right? They wanted to be rulers without question, without any real threats. And so what did they do? They killed off all their close relatives who were adults. And only 2 survived because they were small children. And they at least had the decency not to kill small children. Julian was one of those. But he grew up knowing that these sons of Constantine, these Christian emperors, were the ones who killed his dad and killed his older brothers and killed his cousins. This was a crazy idea to him that these people should be held up as model Christians, and so he had that kind of resentment all of his life, even though he pretended to a Christian life until he took the throne.
Mike, I want to dispel the fact that the church forbade people from reading the Bible. When was the official canon established, and what council did that? Because sadly, too many people think that Catholics are not versed in the Bible. I mean, Jerome put the Bible together. If it wasn't for the Catholic Church, there would be no Bible. What canon established that, and what council?
Well, it happened very gradually. What we find is a general consensus, even in the 100s, about which were the books of the New Testament. All right, and we even find some tentative lists of the books of the Old Testament, but we find other books being cited and quoted as scripture even in those early years. It took a while for the church to say yes to these books and no to these other books. The great criterion for accepting a book as canonical is whether or not it was read at Mass. Okay, that was the thing that confirmed a book's canonicity. Already in the middle of the 300s, we have a list of St. Athanasius that includes all the books of the New Testament as we know it today. Okay, we find that officially declared as binding on the church in the 390s, and then in the first decade of the 400s by councils in North Africa, in Hippo and in Carthage, and later on it's confirmed by the popes and confirmed by local council in Rome as well. But this is how gradually it happened. What we find even in the Bible is that the church precedes the Bible. The Assembly of Israel, as a religious body, precedes the canonization of the Old Testament, the writing of the Old Testament. That's obvious because this thing is always written looking back to a religious order that's always established. The church itself, the New Testament church, is meeting, and we find these meetings described in the Acts of the Apostles and also in the letters of St. Paul and even in the Apocalypse. The church was meeting then before those books of the New Testament were set down. So the church, as the body of believers, the people of God, pre-exists the Bible. It precedes the Bible, and it really is the home of the Bible. It's the place where we come to know what the Bible is. It's the place where we come to encounter the Bible in our worship. The early church knew that, And it's only a millennium later that you find that idea even, being questioned.
You mentioned Saint Athanasius. I think it's providential. Today's his feast day.
Yeah.
He defended orthodoxy. We have Saint, maybe soon to be saint. We have an Archbishop Athanasius now, who also does the same. So to all you listeners out there, we have to defend orthodoxy. It's very important, and that's what he did as a saint, and that's what the current Bishop Athanasius does as well. I mean, you talked a little bit about, Mike, the differences between Roman society before it embraced Christianity, and then the society after, which now gives dignity to people, looks at slave and free equally as the higher classes, the upper echelons of society. You wrote a book, and I think it's a very important book for our listeners to acquire and to read. And the name of that book is How Christianity Saved Civilization and Must Do So Again. What are the ways that everyday lay Catholics can resist, this current culture, eventually, by God's grace, overcome this current culture by embracing, a particular ideology, an orthodox ideology that Catholicism lays out for society, and basically overcome similarly to what the early Christians did with Rome?
Recognize what Jacques Maritain called the primacy of the spiritual in your own life. That's what I'd say. And I think that before we begin to think about changing the world, we have to change ourselves, and we have to undergo a radical kind of discipleship. We have to cultivate a sustained and disciplined life of prayer, personal prayer and communal prayer. We have to live the disciplines of Christian life day by day, especially the discipline of charity. And then we have to go out into the world showing what it looks like to be a Christian. Back in the 60s, I was alive to witness this part of history. We had all those initial guitar hymns, and the one that was so popular was "They'll Know We Are Christians by Our Love." Okay, and it was a song that was actually adapted from the writings of Tertullian, and North African father of the church from the 100s and early 200s. And what he describes there is a Christianity that wore its love the way a slave had to wear a tattoo or a brand. We wear charity like a brand on our bodies, so that when we went out into the world, people recognized our identity, recognized us for who we are by the love that we bore them. And he goes on to enumerate all the different ways that Christians showed that love. We can't withstand the pressure cooker of the modern political situation, or even just the basic situation of social media, and keep our charity unless we have the discipline of prayer. Unless we're going to Jesus Christ, unless we know his constant company, unless we feel his strong nudges whenever we get those impulses to put other people down. The great counter witness to Christianity right now, I think, often is the behavior of Christians, and the things that they say, especially online, but also in other venues. We have to recover that sense that we are the evangelizers, and we can also be the scandalizers. We can be the ones who are turning people away from the faith, not only by the way we're treating them, the people outside the church, but also by the way they see us treat others who are here with us in the church. How do we handle divisions, disagreements, and even slight shades of meaning here within the church? Are we always denouncing ourselves so that we look like a crazy bunch of people to outsiders? That the Christian faith is absurd because those Christians can't even get themselves together on what it means. So yeah, I think that it always has to begin with a personal transformation. We want to revolutionize the world the way our ancestors did, but it always begins with a personal transformation. and then it proceeds to the people next door, not necessarily to the nation immediately from my platform, my grand platform on social media, or even to the state, or even to my town. It always begins with my personal friendships. I think the greatest scandal right now is that we have people weighing in every day on national matters, universal matters, even papal matters, giving their grand opinions, and they don't know the names of their next door neighbors. That's crazy. And you encounter it a lot. People are not evangelizing in any kind of a personal way, and that's why we're shrinking. It's not because of the cowardice of this or that bishop. It's because of the cowardice of me. And that's what we have to change.
Mike, I agree with you 100%. And I'll be honest with you, I'm guilty of many of the things. I'll be completely honest. And it gives me some, pause to think about. Honestly, I believe that. I believe people don't care what you know until they know how much you care.
Yeah.
I have seen that in my own life. The people who have made the biggest impact on me personally were people who were transformed. People like the Franciscan Friars of the Renewal,
Yeah.
people like the Sisters of Life,
Yeah.
people like the Missionaries of Charity.
Yes.
Their love is transformational. It stops people in their tracks. It opens people's minds and ears. Something that Pope Francis said that always stuck with me, and because it's so on point, he said this: you will never argue anyone into the church. If you read every book, if you know everything perfectly, you will never argue anyone into the church, but it is your personal witness that is consistently lived day in and day out, that is observed by people within your circle. When they see this, the Holy Spirit over time will work on them. And then their eyes will be open and their ears will be open as well. I am completely and utterly convinced of that because I have seen it with my own life. Mm-hmm. Malcolm Muggeridge, an intellectual, heard all the arguments. Brilliant man. I believe he went to Oxford. If he didn't go to Oxford, he went to Cambridge. He was a journalist. He heard everything. But it was until he saw Mother Teresa's witness, he became a Catholic. He was the instrument that the Lord used to bring Mother Teresa to the world.
Yes.
An atheist. This is how God works. And this is, you hit it right on the head. I agree with you. And I'm guilty of many of the things that you said.
Same here.
There's a place for argument. All right. But the place for argument is within the context of friendship. We see that even in the works of Plato. We see that in the works of Justin Martyr, who was trying to imitate Plato in many ways, that the best place for argument is within the context of friendship. A very interesting document of the early church is Justin's dialogue with Trypho the Jew. It's sprawling, it's rambling, it's huge. Very few people will take the time to read it from end to end. But what it shows is a conversation over the course of several days between a Christian and a Jew about what it means to be faithful to the God of Israel. And in the end, nobody moves. Nobody's convinced, right? But they remain friends. So what we find there is this kind of, this great context for that kind of conversation, and that's within friendship. Justin Martyr very honestly portrayed that conversation over days and didn't show himself to be the great hero in the end. He didn't convert anybody, but he wanted to show people how it's done. Yes, there's a place for argument, but friendship is the most important thing.
You just described what Benedict called ecumenicalism. Ecumenicalism is not compromise. Ecumenicalism is mutual respect between two people. Ecumenicalism is, you believe that, I believe this. We are friends. I can be your friend. It is God that changes the heart. It is God. And Benedict nails that right on the net. It's perfectly said. Too many times we try to like comport ourselves to somebody else. No. I respect you. Like it's like for instance, I've been to Utah. I don't believe in Mormonism, but I've met Mormons who are very nice people. Mm-hmm. I don't prescribe to your religion. However, I respect you as a human being. I hope you respect me as a human being. We could be friends. And based on my example, may God open your heart.
I have friends.
I think, no, please.
I have friends, and I've had friends since childhood who root for the Dallas Cowboys.
Nice.
I mean, you can have friendship in spite of fundamental differences like that.
Well, that's a fundamental difference. Because I'm going to assume you're a Steelers fan.
Yes, and I have been since childhood, even though I grew up on your side of my state.
Oh, okay.
Baby.
The Philly side.
Yep.
Mike, this has been a great conversation. And we really got out of it what Joe and I hoped to. And there's a lot of information there. So I just want to wind it down with a couple quick questions. What are you working on next? Because I heard a rumor that you might be writing a book on the Blessed Virgin Mary. How true is that?
Well, I finished the book on the Blessed Virgin Mary, and it's due out in the fall. It'll be out from Ave Maria Press. So that'll be out then. I'm trying to remember what the final title is. You know, you get into these negotiations with your publisher at that point. And I think it's called History's Queen. And I show the role that the Blessed Virgin Mary has played in the history of the church in many different ways. So that's finished up. I also just finished a book on St. Joseph that will be out from Scepter Press, probably in early 2021.
Okay. And where can our viewers purchase your books? Where can they see all your books and purchase any of them?
Well, you can see all of them. I think the only complete list I've ever seen anywhere is on Wikipedia, actually, if you look my name up on Wikipedia. But you can find all of them and click through for sale if you look at MikeAquilina.com or FathersOfTheChurch.com. Both URLs go to the same place, FathersOfTheChurch.com, and you can click through to the places where I think you'll get them at the best price.
Okay, and I'll make sure that I link to both of those sites when we post the video. So from Joe and I, Mike, we want to thank you for joining us here at the Front Line with Joe and Joe. Hopefully, we covered the first 500 years of the church. Maybe in our next conversation, you come back and we could maybe pick up, let's say, late antiquity, early Middle Ages, maybe a little Crusades. What do you think?
We could do another 5 years, yeah.
All right. Well, but thank you again, Mike Aquilina. We really appreciate it. And all you good people out there, remember that our conversation is your conversation, and that conversation that's going on everywhere. We'll see you next time.